Classes in session.
How you doing, guys? It's Unlearn 16, classes in session once again. So, this week you just get me all by myself. You know what I've learned this week before I go into the story that I want to start this entire podcast with? I've learned that I should never use a cheese grater or any kind of peeling device. I think we should all know our limits. Maybe that's another story for another time, but I'm telling you right now, I'm gonna have to hire somebody completely new to do this for me because it's too much blood loss. All right, guys. This podcast is going to air Tuesday morning. Now, for those of you in Canada, you know what happens on Monday night. Monday, September 20th, we elect a new government and subsequently a new prime minister in Canada. So today, I want to talk a little bit about leadership. I'm going to take a guess right now. Just so we all know, I'm taking a guess right now. The election has not happened. I'm calling a liberal minority government. I like to put that out there. But that's not what this podcast is about. It's actually not about the government we choose. It's about the leadership we are so desperately in need of. And to start this story, I'm going to tell you a story about when I was, I want to say 7, maybe a little bit older. Could have been 6 to 8, let's say in that range. I was with my mom. And I was at Canada's Wonderland. And again, for Americans who don't know what that is, think of it as our version of Six Flags. Loved Canada's Wonderland as a kid. Always went with my mom. My mom went on every single ride with me, all of that. But when I was little, just like everybody else, I wasn't allowed to go on the cool rides, right? I was restricted due to my height, due to my size. I felt very controlled. And so what did I end up doing? Well, you end up waiting in the exit line for people like, let's say, my uncles to get off the cool rides. So my uncles go on the Mind Buster. And again, for those who don't know the Mind Buster, it's this old rickety wooden roller coaster that literally feels like it might fall apart at any given moment in the ride. I think that's what gives it its appeal. And I'm waiting in the end of the line. I'm watching my uncles on the ride. I'm jealous as all get out. And as I'm standing there, my mom's standing with me, off in the distance, she sees a gentleman walking towards us with 2 children with him, obviously sized enough to be getting off the Mind Buster, a little taller than I was, I guess. And he's about, let's say, a solid 20 feet away. So 20 feet in the distance, I'm standing there beside my mom, grumpy and bitter about not being on the ride, and my mom looks up and she grabs my hand and says, Joanna, that's our prime minister. And I look at her like, as if I care. Is he in charge of the Mind Buster? Can I now get on the ride? But here's where the story gets interesting. From 20 feet away, that's our prime minister, she says, Pierre Trudeau. And he hears this, obviously, and he walks directly up to us, security to his side, and instead of putting his hand out and saying hello to my mom, instead of trying to sway that vote in some way, shape, or form, he does it in a different way. He's still swaying votes. Come on, guys, he is a politician. But before even looking at my mom, before even acknowledging my mom, he bends down, gets on one knee, puts out his hand and says, "Nice to meet you, Joanna," and shakes my hand. I shook his hand. Sure, I didn't know who he was, but fantastic. I shake his hand. My mom looks down at this interaction, and I'm pretty sure Pierre thought that vote is in the bag. But he didn't have my mom's vote. Just for reference, my mom wasn't a huge Trudeau fan. But when I tell that story, and when my mom tells me that story, I'm a fan. I'm a fan of a couple things. I'm a fan of the fact that he could hear us, or he was aware of us 20 feet away. I'm also a fan of the fact that he, being a very intelligent person, knows probably he wasn't going to win my mom over with a handshake to her, but he might. He just might win it over by focusing on her kid first. And he doesn't just he doesn't just lean over and shake my hand. He puts his knee right on that grubby, dirty Canada's Wonderland floor and shakes my hand and gives me a bit of time in that interaction. I often think about that, and then as I got older, stories of Pierre Trudeau back in the day, and I'll tell you a couple on this podcast. He always emulated a level of confidence and a level of authenticity. Now, does that mean he always did the right thing? Oh, good God, of course not. Absolutely not. And I could list off a bunch of reasons why I didn't agree with him, especially when it came to a lot of our Indigenous peoples. But did you know that when he spoke, he was saying what he actually thought? Guys, I've watched back footage after footage after footage, and I believe him. A lot of other people don't know this. So one of probably the most famous stories of Pierre Trudeau, outside of meeting me when I was little, because I'm sure that stuck with him through his life, was him dealing with Canada's one and only really or significant domestic terrorism issue. So back in the 70s, we had a group called the FLQ, and the FLQ was fixated on separation of Quebec from the rest of Canada. And in order to push their agenda, they placed bombs inside mailboxes in a relatively affluent and predominantly English-speaking part of Quebec. And they thought if these affluent English people got scared enough, they'd leave Quebec. And if they left Quebec, then the rest of Quebec, the rest of the French-speaking Quebec, could vote together and vote to separate from the rest of Canada. Now, these bombs in mailboxes didn't work very well. There were injuries, but nobody died. And at this point, they escalated. And they escalated by kidnapping two political officials, a trade commissioner and a member of parliament. One of these officials actually dies. We don't know if it was purposefully, but he was locked in the trunk of a car. I'm assuming suffocates and dies. And it's at this point, Pierre Trudeau and the federal government decide to militarize Quebec. In the United States, it's called martial law, and in Canada, it's called the War Measures Act. So he militarizes Quebec. He allows troops on the streets. He arrests without cause, without warrant, without any due process. Many French-speaking men between the ages, I believe, of 18 to 34. And as he's doing this, he's in Ottawa, still running Parliament, and he steps out of Ottawa. And I guess back in the day, it was quite easy, or a little bit easier, for a newspaper reporter or a television reporter to catch him on the way out. And as he's coming out, a reporter catches him and says something to the effect of, "Mr. Trudeau, do you believe that you can just walk over everybody else's civil rights and militarize our streets and take away all of our freedoms that Canada holds so dear just to find these terrorist threats that you think are so incredibly important? You really think you can get away with something like that?" And without skipping a beat, and please look up the footage if you have a minute, because it is brilliant. Without skipping a beat, Trudeau smirks and says, "Just watch me." Now, look, we could have a whole other podcast discussing about whether he should or shouldn't have done that. Just to wrap up the end of the story, he finds the FLQ, he arrests who he needs to arrest, crisis averted. So, the whole does the ends justify the means, that's a whole other podcast. That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about leadership. I'm talking about the kind of person that can look in the media and say, "Just watch me." Now, I've been obviously a teacher for quite some time, and recently I've really been watching our political system. We've had Trump in the United States. We've had some interesting people into Canada, both federally and provincially across the country. And I'm looking at these people, and I think what we're all waiting for, what we're all begging for, is a leader. And I'm really unsure or unclear about why we can't find one. I think that Trump, for example, sorry, mentioning his name a couple times now, I think he gave the illusion of saying what was on his mind. I think he gave the illusion of authenticity. Now, this kind of authenticity was filled with so much bigotry and just horrific pieces of media and media. I mean, I can't describe, and I'm not going to go back into his political history, about the things in which he said and got away with, and he said with pride. And I think in the absence of great leadership, we will look for anybody we deem authentic in any way, shape, or form. We did it in Canada. We've done it in Ontario with different leaders. We've done it with the mayor of Toronto. We've done it with the premier of Ontario. We have these predominantly men who stand up and say the most bigoted things in some capacity, sometimes classist, sometimes racist, sometimes sexist. And all of a sudden, they're a man of the people, right? I'm still convinced to this day that a lot of Trump's tweets that were misspelled and grammatically incorrect were purposefully done. They were purposefully done so that the average person sitting in the United States goes, that guy's just like me. He doesn't care about how you use they or they are. I think that he can understand me. He understands who I am, where I'm coming from. There's no pretense. I think Trump faked that authenticity incredibly well, and a lot of our politicians try. But what worries me is in the absence of true leadership, true authenticity coming from a place of justice and social equity and rule of law, we are starved for anybody that seems as though they're not controlled by a party or a media outlet or a sponsor or an advertiser. And I think we get wound up in accepting the bare minimum of leadership because we think that they haven't been bought and sold and paid for in the grand scheme of things. I think the fight to find somebody who actually has great ideas that they will stand behind is incredibly difficult. So that leads me to my next quote, which is probably one of my most favorite historical and political quotes, I guess. And it was by Abraham Lincoln, and it's not going to be for the reasons you guys think. So Lincoln once said, "I'd like to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky." I think about that quote a lot. I think about it because it truly infuriates me. I know a lot of people are like, who's your favorite president of all time? And pretty much 90% of people say Lincoln. I would not, for different reasons than most. But that quote really, really sticks with me. And I feel as though that's the quote that has broken politics. And by the way, it's just as much our fault as it is theirs. Number one, we want to believe that a leader can do great things and cost no money. We want to think a leader can change the world in which we live, and we aren't going to have to suffer or to give up anything that we already have. But what we've realized, or what you should be realizing, is that every time a leader promises something for nothing, we are disappointed. Guys, that's just as much our fault as it is theirs. So, I'd like to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky. What does that mean? Well, it means that most politicians, if not all politicians, are going to be pragmatic before they are moral. They are going to do what they need to do to get a job done, but maybe not the right job done for two reasons. Number one, because nothing's going to get done if they don't make compromise. And number two, and here's a real kicker, they want to stay in office. We've ceased to think of anything, and I don't know if we ever did, that occurs in the long term. We talk about things like the environment, and we discuss them as though within a 4 or 5 year term, any politician from any party is going to be able to make significant change. Let me be the one to tell you, it's not going to happen. Of course it's not going to happen. But we want something, especially if you're going to cost us money, we want to see change now. It's that instant gratification thing. We're not looking for a leader. We're looking for somebody who is going to placate us now. And that's incredibly problematic. And again, I want to point out, that's not just the fault of politicians. Most great things to change are going to take years to actually make that impact. And I like to say all the time, we can either pay now or we can pay later. Right? People talk all the time about the ways in which we fund politicians and the ways in which we pour money into different things going on into our country right now. But we are only thinking about a quick return. We're not thinking about pouring money into education, so in the next 20 years, we see a significant change in the kind of individuals who are critical thinkers and world changers. We need to see it now. We need to see it within your term, or guess what? We're not giving you another shot at it. Right? So you have guys like Trump come into power, and they bring things instantaneously, right? I think he brought coal mining back, for the love of Pete. He brings it back instantaneously, but what does that serve? It's an instant gratification. Look what I did, but where's the long term? Where's the sustainability? Where's the country that I actually want to build? Where's the more intelligent, forward-thinking nation that has to know we have to be converting our resources into renewable energy sources? We want to know what's quick. We want to know what's easy. And we constantly are shocked by why we don't get great leaders. Well, guys, we're not allowing them to be great. We're ensuring they're not great by making them come up with solutions that only take 4 years. And I think that now more than ever, we need to start looking at underlying principles of individuals rather than just simply, how much tax are you taking out of my pocket? Where's the money going to go? And how quickly can I see a return on my money that you're spending? That's not the way building a nation works. And it's about time a leader said so. Give me 1 minute and I'll be right back. All right, so what makes a great leader? Authenticity is key. Absolutely, authenticity is key. I think we are looking for somebody to look us in the face and say, guys, if you want more social services, if you want more equity in this world, in this country, it's going to cost you money. Wouldn't you love, and again, in the United States and in Canada, I'm sure all over the world, wouldn't you respect somebody that says, guys, we're going to fix the environment, but it's going to cost us a lot of money, and it is going to change our economy. And at some point, the economy is going to have to take a significant hit as we change from this type of environmental regulation to this. Are we ready to respect that kind of honesty and authenticity? Or do we still want the guy that says, don't worry, nothing in the economy is going to change, everybody's going to keep working, nobody has to go back to school, no major infrastructure needs to be adjusted, we're just going to plow through and everything's going to be perfect? Is that what we're looking for? Guys, deep down, I don't care who you are, I don't care what your background is, where your family's from, deep down, you gotta know that that's not true. And I also want from my leaders, I also want them to be honest about who they are. Now, I'm not talking about who they're married to and if they've ever cheated on their wife or husband or how many dogs they have. Look, these aren't the things that speak to who they are. I'm tired of getting all wound up in that. I want to know who they are and where they stand on major issues. I did a 20 question TikTok not too long ago on things I would like to ask the leaders running in the Canadian system. And a lot of people are like, Joanna, why are you bothering? I'm going to take this opportunity to explain a couple to them. Like, why are you bothering talking about capital punishment? Canada, I mean, I know in the States it's still an issue, but Canada, I mean, it's been illegal forever. So what's the point? Why do we need to know what that individual thinks? I'll tell you why. Because the way that somebody looks at punishment, the way somebody conceptualizes how we handle our criminals is going to go way past simple capital punishment or not. Do you believe our system is fair? Do you believe it's just? How do you, if you believe that, please cite some examples. And if you believe it's not just, if it's not fair, I'm going to put racist and sexist over here for a minute. Let's deal with the biggest problem. I don't know if it's the biggest problem, but in my opinion, a significant limitation to our justice system is money. He or she who can buy the most lawyers, the best, a table full of lawyers, is going to have a much greater probability of getting off whatever crime that possibly has been committed. We look at civil rights legislation, civil legislation, not civil rights, but civil legislation, contract law. Party A sues Party B. We know that whoever can put the most money on one side of that equation tends to win. How is that just? How can we build any society? How can a leader stand beside a system? And we don't talk about these things, by the way, because we're so busy arguing about another 3% on our taxes. Because we're not talking about the real issues. This kind of criminal justice, or lack thereof justice, is the fundamental building block of the way the whole society is going to be run. And I'm not just talking about, some people not going to prison or going for too long or being wrongly identified and wrongly accused and therefore incarcerated. I'm talking about all the people that don't go to jail. I'm talking about all the people that don't ever pay their price and they get away with it time and time and time again. And they do that by how much money they have on that table. I want to know if my politician, if my leader believes that capital punishment, that the death penalty is an actual deterrent. Why? Well, because that's how the law is going to be set up. Every law after that. Do you believe that these harsh laws is what actually changes crime in this country? Because I promise you it doesn't. But if you believe that, I want to hear about it. That's who they are. And if we know a couple of these fundamental, I'm only going to talk about a few of these fundamental aspects of who they are and how they view the world, then you know what? We're going to recognize how they're going to deal with circumstance A, B, and C. Because let's be honest, no politician can run under the auspice that they're going to know every single thing that's going to come at them and the way they're going to deal with it. Is the Constitution important to them? Is the Supreme Court and the legitimacy of the Supreme Court important to them? All of that matters, right? So we need to start looking at the bigger picture. I think the more narrowly focused we get, and the more, what are you going to do with my $10,000 we get, we lose sight of the fact that big, huge world events are in constant competition with what any politician wants to do. Look at COVID, for crying out loud. We couldn't have seen this coming a mile away. You have the president of any country, the prime minister of any country, scrambling to figure out, who am I in this circumstance? How do I spend the money? How do I take care of my citizens? All of that could have been sort of shaped and seen if we knew some of their fundamental character. Not promised us the earth, moon, and stars with little to no tax, increase whatsoever. So I think about that. I also think about the way that our politicians reflect on education. How much money are you willing to put into it? What's a fair class size? How do you view private and public education? How do I create? Let's assume for a minute, I know this is a huge assumption, but let's assume for a minute I want to create the best and the brightest I possibly can. Do we have a system that can do that? Are we funding it enough to do that? If there's 40 kids in a grade 6 classroom, how much education is going on there? These are big questions. And again, if a politician can sit there and say, you know what, 40 grade 6s are perfectly fine, that's legitimate, that's what we're going to roll with, then I need to know that's where he or she stands. I also think about things like mental health and healthcare. In the United States and in Canada, if I hear one more politician talk about mental health as though it's this, catch-all phrase that they throw it out there and say, I really care about mental health. Your mental health matters to me, but nobody does a thing. I want to know what you're going to do. I want to know how much it matters. Money-wise, how much does it matter? Children welfare matters? Great. How much are you going to pay social workers? How much of an education are they going to have? What are their dockets going to look like? How much of their case files are they going to have? All of these are foundational questions. I know in the United States, there's been a lot about abortion rights, or a lack thereof. A lot about governments trying to skirt the issue. And everybody in Canada looks down at places like Texas and Florida and, oh gosh, we love to make judgments, right? Yet we have political parties here who are trying to subtly and softly find ways around it. Find ways around constitutional and Supreme Court rulings in order, at the very least, to make it more difficult, if not impossible, for women to access that level of health care. And again, I'm not asking you if you're pro-life or pro-choice. That's a different debate for a different podcast, although it would be a good one. I want to know where my leaders stand. I want to know what kind of laws will they allow to be manipulated. And that's why those things are incredibly important to me. And I think we see them happen time and time and time again. And in Texas, that's all they're trying to do. They're trying to bypass the law. They're trying to figure out a way to get around Roe v. Wade so that women within Texas, within other parts of the United States, cannot gain access to that health care without directly challenging Roe v. Wade, because they know that the Supreme Court, even a Republican Supreme Court, and by the way, Republican Supreme Courts have consistently upheld Roe v. Wade, can't make any statements about it. Now, I think Texas will be overturned, but that's not the point. That's not the point. Because it's that kind of legislation and pushing for that kind of legislation that shows what a government official's character is, where their values lie, where their morals lie. I'd like to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky. That's the kind of statement where if you're willing to do that, if that's how you're going to run politics, if that's how you're going to run the government, we are always going to be left with leaders who don't lead, who react, with leaders that are too afraid to do what's right because they're too busy trying to do what we expect or what makes us happy in that time. And we've seen this with COVID. We've seen leader after leader. Guys, every doctor on this planet, scientists from across the world have told us what we need to do. And what are we doing? We're sidestepping it. Because getting reelected is much more important than keeping people safe during a pandemic. That's not leadership. You don't always like what a leader does. But a true leader, A, you know where they stand, and B, they're not afraid to take those steps. They're not afraid to be unpopular. Some people ask me who my favorite leader in Canada is, and we've had a lot of doozies, don't get me wrong. And probably one of my favorites is a guy named John Diefenbaker. And most people don't even know of anything about him as Prime Minister. There's two reasons this gentleman is impressive to me. Number one, he stood against apartheid when nobody else cared to. In the 1960s, Diefenbaker stood against apartheid in South Africa. Let's recognize for the fact that apartheid didn't end until 1994. In the 1960s, Diefenbaker also passed a federal Bill of Rights for Canada. For those who don't know Canadian history and the way that we didn't have a Bill of Rights. We didn't even have our own constitution, our legitimate constitution until 1982. We followed what Britain said. But this Bill of Rights talked about the rights of not to be discriminated based on your religion, your sex, your race. These are huge concepts. That as an individual, he was a leader, I promise you. Levels of sexism and racism and religious discrimination abounded then by our political leaders and by our public. You know, I think a lot of people get confused at what democracy actually is. And as this airs Tuesday morning, we'll have found out how we voted in Canada, and a lot of people just think it's voting. What's a democracy? Well, you go out and you vote. Guys, that's like 10% of a democracy. 10%. There's lots of countries where there's elections and there's no democracy. Big aspect of democracy has to be the fact it's integral that we have a written constitution based on the rule of law that is highly enforced. That isn't, we don't sway to the popular opinion of the day. I believe that Jefferson thought that every, I want to say 15 years, he believed the Constitution should be rewritten. He believed that societies change, they alter, our values change. You know, the very nature of who we are adjusts, and we shouldn't be held to such staunch traditional beliefs that were written in 1776, or in Canada's case, even 1982. We get better. We get smarter. You know? And I think that as a leader, you have to be ready to lead for that kind of change rather than benefit from the old niches of power that you can rely on. I also think it's a problem to promise the world with, like, it's not like I'm sitting here saying we don't need any economic plan. The heck with money. We'll just print more. Nobody's saying that. There needs to be a viable way to build that. But I think there's two kinds of people in this world. And unfortunately, there's more of one than the other. I think there are people, leaders and citizens alike, who believe that the first thing we have to establish, the very first thing, is a just, equitable society. And I'm going to explain the difference between equality and equity in a second. And if we create that just and equitable society, then and only then can we build a strong, sustainable, legitimate economy. And then there's the other people. The other people, you can tell by my deep sigh what side of the fence I sit on. But then there's the other people who believe economy comes first. That making money comes first. That when we have enough money, society will become just. I've never heard such a wrong statement in my entire life, and I think history has proven that the latter is impossible. Absolutely impossible. Whatever your foundation is, that is what it's going, that is the house you're going to build. So if I'm looking to build an economy and I'm looking to make money, because that's what an economy is, especially in a capitalist system. How do we all make money? And I get that, and I get why that's important. But if I'm not doing it under the basis of equality and equity and rule of law, the system will always be unjust. And if the system's unjust, it will always be challenged, and it will always be weak, fragmented, and ready to crumble. And nobody wants to live in that system. But if you were to base a system, and let me define this really quickly. If you were to base a system on equity, not equality. I think a lot of people, I'm going to get so many comments under here. Joanna's such a communist. I don't hate Marxism. But communism is not what I'm preaching here. Equality would mean everybody is treated exactly the same. I think that's asinine. I've been a teacher for a very long time. you can't treat everybody the same. People have different passions and different ways of getting at knowledge and different ways of changing the world. And if we treated them all the same and judged them all exactly the same, we would have a very limited society at our disposal. You know, you can have a student who knows everything about political science, but you ask them to sit down and write it down on a piece of paper, and the translation gets lost and they get frustrated. Maybe their fine motor skills are problematic. Maybe just their head to paper sometimes doesn't quite translate into what we think it needs to translate into. And they sit down and they try to write that paper, they try to write that test, and they get a 50 or they get a 60 and they go about their day. But if I pulled that same kid aside and I sat them down and I asked them to explain it, I asked them what the theories were, I asked them about the application, and they can hold court for an hour explaining cause and effect and interpretation and this theorist and this theorist and this is how it plays out in the real world. What did I just lose there? Because the kid that got 60 will walk away from that class and never take it again. But the kid that was given another way to relay the information is going to feel empowered. And forget them feeling empowered. I just got better for it. They walk away with a 90, and guess what? Now they're a part of the political system. Now they're a part of the economic system. Now they're a part of the social system where their actual ideas can change the world. You know, the less equity we give this planet and people around us, be selfish about it. I say to people all the time, listen, racism, sexism, homophobia, religious, whatever classism, whatever kind of ism that is restricting you from actually hearing somebody's idea or giving somebody else a shot, you're limiting your world and you are limiting any progress we could have because of them. Everything gets crappier. It's, again, be selfish. Worry about, you want the best. We want to live in the world with the best scientific advancements, the best political advancements. We all want to live in a world where we feel safe and we feel empowered and we feel like we have a role and sort of an authentic way of living. We want that. Everybody wants that. And the more we stop somebody else's, or the more we allow other people's to be halted or minimized or squashed, the worse our world gets. You know, we could have cured cancer by now had we let certain people that we didn't deem appropriate or good enough or intelligent enough into fields of science and research. If we would have given them different ways to test rather than sitting down and writing an MCAT. What if? What if all of our structure about the what, how, and when, and why we're applying it to these individuals, what if that structure has actually gotten our way? And obviously that structure comes from top down, which is why I talk about the system that has to be built based on that feeling of equity and actual rule of law. When you allow money to buy your way into something or out of something, when you allow, you know, that person's sex to be more important than that person, or the way they dress or the way they wear their hair in order to dictate who they are and the chances they're going to get, we've limited our whole world. And so I'm waiting for a leader. I'm begging for a leader that's willing to say that. You know, that's truly willing to say, could you imagine a leader of any country in their inaugural speech get up there and say, we don't live in a great country. We live in a good country. You want us to compare us to other countries? Sure, we're doing better. I love Canada. People are going to be like, oh, I love the country in which I live. But make no mistake, if we want to become better, we have to. We don't just admit and say, oh, sorry about that. There has to be restitution. And it's not just about restitution for that group of people, whether it's Indigenous people in Canada, whether it's the lower classes in Canada or women or what. It's not just about restitution to the people that we have committed damage against. It's about changing the fundamental structures so we build something just and equitable from the ground up. And then, guys, the economy will take care of itself because we'll build something that makes sense. It doesn't make sense. Look, I'm not even going to begin to pretend as though I'm an expert on oil refineries and natural gas and petroleum products and plastics, and I'm not. Here's what I know. They're finite resources. They will, at some point, completely and utterly run out. Here's what I also know. They're doing horrific damage to our environment. Again, I don't need to prove global warming here to say it's not good. In Toronto, I think last year there was something like 20 days in the summer that city employees weren't actually supposed to go out and work because the air quality index was so horrible. Right? So these are the times where I think we need to search for people who are willing to have real, authentic conversations about who they are, what they believe, who they're going to surround themselves with, and the long-term plan of implementing fundamental change to a system that was not built to be equitable. That was never the point of the system. Everybody wants to make money, everybody wants to be profitable, but it was never to be equitable. It was never to be just, fundamentally just, or we wouldn't have had slavery. We wouldn't have broken every contract we ever signed with the indigenous people. The fundamental guiding principle was to make money and take over land. So we need a leader that does better. But guys, here's the bottom line. And here's the hard part. We have to understand that leader, that individual, if a person has the self-awareness and the strength to stand up in front of a nation or a city council or a provincial legislature or a state legislature and say these things, you have to take a step back and understand change is going to be slow, and it's not going to be easy, and it's going to cost everybody money. You just have to decide, do you want to pay now or do you want to pay later? Do you want to protect our kids now or deal with the criminal justice system later? Do you want to have health actually matter, mental health mattering now, or do you want to deal with addiction later? When do you want to pay? Because I promise you're going to. Do you want to fix our environment and change the nature, the basis of where we derive our energy from? Or do you want to wait until it is done and we have to suffer such irrevocable trauma in order to transition? Do you want to pay now or do you want to pay later? You choose. Dismissed.